All right, hello everyone. Welcome to this week's Snack and Chat live on our Adopt a Life Provincial page. We hope everyone's doing well. For those of you on spring break at home with your kids, we hope you're doing okay. We're doing the best we can. So here we are, Snack and Chat, our weekly Facebook Live, where we explore topics that are top of mind for our families formed by adoption, kinship, and custody care. My name is Chantal. I'm part of the Adopt for Life team, and of course, our lovely host, Catherine Connors. For those of you that are joining us live, thank you for tuning in. Feel free to put your comments or questions in the chat. Give us a thumbs up or a heart. Let us know you're there. We do want to remind you that because it's live on our public Facebook page, that whatever comments you do put in the chat, that means they're available on the internet forever. So just be mindful of the information that you're putting in there. So thank you for that. And as well, if you're watching this on replay, same thing goes for those comments as well. So that's sort of my housekeeping spiel for the moment. I'm going to quickly pass it over to Catherine today because we have so many questions for our guest. You guys inundated us and we know how fast 45 minutes goes by. So before I pass it off, I do want to take a moment just to introduce, I know most of you already know who Sharon Roszia is, but for those of you that might not be as familiar, Sharon is an internationally known educator, presenter, and author who has devoted over 50 years of her professional career to the institution of foster care, adoption, and relative care. While working in public and private agencies, as well as private practice venues, she has focused on crisis pregnancy and fertility, infant adoptions, placement of children from the foster care system, including sibling groups and teenagers, and search and reunion. Sharon has also parented by birth, adoption, and foster care, and has watched her family grow to include 7 great grandchildren. She has watched the powerful forces of genetics play out in her growing family and the impact of the lifelong implications of adoption on each family member. Both as a professional and a family member, she was led to develop a perspective on these lifelong implications, along with friend and colleague Deborah Silverstein, which have framed her life work into the 7 core issues of adoption, upon which trainings and writings have been based. Sharon is semi-retired and consulting with Kinship Center, a member of the Seneca family of agencies. She is also a contributing writer to Fostering Families magazine and Adopt Talk. I know there's so much more that goes into your biography, Sharon, but I did have to cut it short because I think we could spend just half an hour talking about all your achievements. So we are so honored to have you here with us today and taking time out of your very busy schedule. So welcome, and I'll pass it over to you, Catherine. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the lovely introduction. I appreciate that.
You're very excited. And I know we have a lot of families who are tuning in right now who are just honored to have the opportunity to hear you talk and to answer some of the questions that have come up. So I'm just going to go ahead and jump into it if you're okay with that. And
I'm just fine with it.
we'll try our best to get to them all. And for those of you who are watching live as well, if you do have a question, we do absolutely want to encourage you to do that. But just know that we may not be able to answer them live. But we're absolutely more than happy to try and connect with you after as well to answer any questions you have. So first question that we have for you, when you first developed, we'll talk about the article maybe first. So when you first developed the article, what was really your inspiration behind the 7 core issues of adoption and permanency? Was it something that was personal or professional or maybe a mixture of both?
I think our original drive, because originally I was the Silverstein social worker when they adopted a 14-year-old. And we became very good friends. In fact, they moved into my neighborhood because they wanted their social worker in their own backyard. We became friends. We started lecturing around the country at various conferences on the adoption of adolescents. And we were concerned on 2 levels. One, our children, particularly because they'd come home at older ages, had deep connections to their families and communities of origin. And they frequently were dealing with a variety of feelings that came from us as parents, from their first family members, from siblings not raised with them and siblings raised with them, all of that. And we were trying to find a way that they could talk about these feelings as being normal and bring people together rather than having to make choices and make adoption about subtraction instead of addition. And there wasn't anybody really talking about that. The other part was that we watched the adoption community at that time in particular, in the 80s, being very divided. There were conferences for adoptees, conferences for birth first parents, conferences for adoptive parents, conferences for foster parents, and they never crossed over. In fact, we had a fantasy that maybe one day they'd all meet at the same time in the same city, and there'd be little buses and we could go back and forth and visit each other's perspectives in different conferences. So that was the driving force. And we spent a lot of time really studying the feelings, not the experiences, because being infertile is very different than having to become separated from your child, or growing up adopted is different than being an adoptive parent. So we weren't interested in the specific experiences. What we were interested in was the feelings behind those experiences, which we quickly found were almost identical across the board. That if you didn't know whether you were speaking to a birth first family member or an adoptive family member or an adopted adult, you wouldn't have known if you just talked about feelings. And so it was a way to normalize what really is an abnormal situation. Family separation and reforming is an abnormal situation. And we wanted to normalize the feelings connected to that and say, we all feel that way. It's normal. We're not pathological. There's nothing pathological about it. And to give people a way to talk about it with each other that wouldn't get kids caught in the middle.
Yeah, and I remember when I had, so for those of you who don't know, so the 7 core issues, anyone who has taken Pathways to Permanency training, this is based on this. So the core work that you've done, as you mentioned, the 80s, it's still hugely impactful. And I remember when I was taking the course and first reading the book, it occurred to me that as an adoptive parent, how much intersectionalities there actually were in those emotions. And for myself, I realized how us and them I had put myself. And it wasn't until I really understood, no, we all are grieving, we all are dealing with these feelings, that I really was able to kind of almost check myself in my reactions and emotions and be able to move on to the next stage of healing, and in turn supporting my kids and supporting their family. So I remember it was such an eye-opening moment to realize that the 7 core issues isn't an adopted child thing. It isn't a birth, it's all of us. We're all together. So
we're all in the same boat, and anybody rocks the boat, it affects all of us. But even more important to me as a parent, as well as a professional, is that, we are the leaders of the orchestra. So if we don't have these issues addressed, we can't help our children as they move through their understanding of what they've lost, as well as what they've gained. We can't help them master their issues if we're stuck. Our kids only get as far as we get. And that's why it's so important that we know the core issues and we address them in our own individual lives.
Absolutely. Which I mean, this is probably a question, I'm probably jumping the gun, but I think which is why it's so important for adoptive kin and customary care parents. My belief is to do the work even before the kids are placed, as you're going through the home study. If you're being triggered or if you're questioning, like, this is the time,
right,
to do it all.
I totally agree with that. And my co-author, I don't know if people have seen the book, but it's a pretty thick book, as you can see, obviously marked up by me. But my co-author and I, Allison Davis Maxon, decided that families needed to know how to do the work. So we actually wrote a workbook, hopefully for people to use. It'll come out the end of this year, but hopefully for people to use before they get into parenting. That would be ideal, but it's never too late to do it. And actually, I'm so many years down the road with this, but we did it on ourselves, or we did the work ourselves after we wrote the workbook. And I was amazed at what still was coming up for me. It's never too late to do the work.
Absolutely. And we do know there's families who actually go to the training multiple times at different stages because they realize that thing. And as our kids get older and new things come up, this is just a way. So I'm super excited for that workbook. So I know we'll absolutely be sharing it as well. So it's super exciting. Okay, so I think we've kind of answered this, but I'm going to go ahead and ask as well. So when you first wrote the article, did you have it in your mind at all that it would become a book, that it would become, such a fundamental thing that impacts so many families? Did you kind of go into it thinking that, you have this book, it would go into training, or did it kind of develop organically?
Well, when Deborah and I did it, I don't think we had a clue the impact it was going to have. And we got that clue about a year after we'd written it and started talking about it by bringing together purposefully members of the adoption constellation, which is the word we use today, as you know, which comes right out of Canada from Dr. Michael Grand's work. What we did is we gathered together members of the community that we personally knew were members of the constellation, but we asked them to not reveal who they were, and we fed them, we brought them together, we filmed it for a whole day. And although they had first names on their name tag, nobody really knew who anybody else was at the table. And we walked them through the emotions all day long. We took them through a series of exercises, and there was a lot of crying and laughing and hugging, and we had all that on video. And at the end of the session, at the end of the day, we asked them to take off the stickers on their name tags and reveal what part of the constellation they were. And people were absolutely blown away. I mean, there were comments like, I never thought I'd ever hug a birth mother or a birth father. Or I'm, as an adoptee, I never have ever talked to anybody who relinquished or lost their child to the system. Or as an adoptive parent, I've been so frightened of the birth first family, and here I've made a friend sitting right next to me, and I've really been able to walk in her shoes without knowing who she was or who he was. So we knew we had something. I was like, whoa, okay. They all shifted in their perspective. And then we started presenting at the American Adoption Congress, which is a mixture at that time in the 80s, mostly of adoptees, adult adoptees, and birth first family members, some social workers, very few adoptive parents. And people in the audience would sob, and they'd say things like, thank you for giving us a language. Thank you for helping us feel normal. Then we knew, but we got so busy with it, we never had time to write a book. We wrote the article, did a lot of interviews, but that's as far as it got until all of you in Canada started getting some training around this. And Allison Davis Maxon, who was one of the trainers who came in and trained the trainers in Canada, came back to me, and we'd worked together for many years at Kinship Center, and said, we need a book. We need a book. And if you and Deborah aren't going to write it, you and I have to write it, but we need a book. So that's what led to where the book is now.
Wow. Just amazing. You can see like the need for it, and people, I think we're just probably so thirsty to actually have language. And I know for me, it was a lot of validation. It was a lot of validation. And I remember feeling so insecure as a brand new parent. I mean, I was in my 20s when we adopted. So I was young. And I remember just being so overwhelmed and not understanding, you read about trauma and you read about loss, but until you actually experience it, it's two very different things. So I remember actually going back and having going to my doctors and saying, like, this is what I think it is. Like, can someone else read this for me? So I know I felt it was very impactful for me.
Thank you for sharing that. And I remember Deborah sharing that she was a therapist for many years. She's retired. But I remember her saying that she handed clients the article, and the woman read it and then came back in for a session. And she said she had it on her lap and she kept stroking it and going, "Thank you for this. I feel normal for the first time."
That's
Thank
exactly my feelings.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember that. And I remember going to my doctors and therapists and saying, see, see, it's not in my head. Other
Right.
people get it.
Right.
So I want to make sure we talk about, and I appreciate we don't have the time to dive deep into many of these things, but I know a lot of our families are wondering if you could briefly, to the best of your ability, describe what the 7 core issues are. So I don't know if you're more comfortable naming it and maybe having a brief description, but it was a question that came up a few times.
You bet. You bet. No, I'm happy to. Why talk about something that we haven't defined? So that makes perfect sense to me. But initially when we described the core issues, they were linear. They were on a chart. But they've evolved because what we've realized is that each one kind of nests on the one that comes before. So imagine a wagon wheel, okay? And because we all know what those look like on old stagecoaches and stuff from Western. So think about a wagon wheel. And in the middle of that wagon wheel is a big round piece that we're connecting to. That piece is called loss. And if we could, we'd paint it bright red because it's flaming like the sun. It's hot and difficult and scary. But everybody has losses before they gain anything in adoption. And it's the recognition of those losses that allow us to get healthy and actually experience the joy and the mastery that adoption can bring to us. And I'm saying adoption, but it's shorthand for foster care and kinship care as well. Just kind of wanting everybody to know that. And by the way, it also connects to third-party reproduction, donor insemination, surrogacy, and the book does expand out the concept into those communities as well. So that loss that has to be acknowledged, and I have to always say that the devil's in the detail. It's the tiny little losses that come up and hit us every day that hurt the most. It's not, it's not the big things, it's often the little things. And there are different kinds of losses. There's vicarious losses, secondary losses, ambiguous losses. We go into that quite a bit in the book, and everybody has them. Because we are trying to figure out how not to have those losses again, we experience the first spoke. Remember how a wheel has a center and then it has spokes. So there's 6 spokes that come out and connect to this outer frame or around which we kind of roll along. That's how we kind of roll along on that wheel. So that first spoke is going to be rejection, feelings of rejection or fear of rejection. And the reason we experience it that way is because if we can personalize the losses and figure out what happened, maybe we can stop them from happening again. So it's a kind of a stab at some control because everybody loses control when they're in that loss place. And so what happens with rejection is it impacts our self-esteem. And that leads to the next spoke, which is shame and guilt. Shame and guilt being very different. Shame developing even in utero. So some of our children are born with shame if they weren't acknowledged, if their parents didn't want them, if they didn't eat, if they caused pain, if they were in a violent relationship, whatever it might be. So we can actually come into the world carrying shame. And shame is a very early, often pre-verbal, lives in our cellular body experience. Guilt comes as we attach to somebody and we begin to kind of catch their perspective on what's okay and what isn't okay. And so attachment is required before guilt can grow. And that's real important for our families who adopt children at an older stage of life. They have to attach to us before they're going to learn from us, before they're going to listen to us. That's real important. And guilt usually surfaces for most of us around ages 7 and 8, when we're deeply attached and out in the community and carrying our parents, if you will, around us, with us in our mind and in our hearts and literally in our bodies. And so shame and guilt is around, again, self-esteem. And the book goes into the conditions of self-esteem that all get kind of knocked asunder, if you will, by the losses. The next core issue, the next spoke, is grief. And grief is really the gateway to healing. If we aren't willing to identify our losses, maybe do a loss history, not just connected to our constellation experience, but all of us had losses growing up. It's just a part of life. We have to start back at the beginning, and we have to have like a loss inventory. We need to get to know ourselves so we know what we're supposed to be grieving. Grieving is hard work. It's upsetting. It takes time. And what's tricky for our children in this one is that children understand their losses in little bits and pieces, fits and starts, as their development unfolds. And really, most adult adoptees haven't fully understood, or children who grew up in the foster care system, they can be, when the brain comes online full force, it can be 25, 26, 27 before they have this gigantic aha. And sometimes they really begin a deeper grief process even there. And of course, most of them have left home by then. So that's a whole other issue in the community that needs to be addressed by the therapists that might be listening. So grief is the hard work. Grief is the place that we have to kind of clean out the cobwebs. And if we do that work, then we can move on to what I call the healing side. So the next spoke is the spoke of identity. And the main question around that is, who am I really? Who am I really? Am I a brown and a green? Am I a brown only? What does it mean that I have 16 possible family trees out there, some of which I don't know anything about? And we quote Andrew Solomon's work called Far from the Tree about horizontal and vertical identities, what we get from the people who raise us and what we get from our genetics, that whole nature, nurture, Siamese twin issue. How much did I get from my family of origin? How much am I getting from the people who raise me, love me, and nurture me every day? And how much is unique to me? Because there never was and never will be again another human being ever like you. We're all unique. And so what do we bring forth? Why are we here? So figuring that out as adoptive, foster, and kinship parents, birth first parents, and the children who have been changed on family trees becomes part of our identity work. And it's confusing, it's difficulty, and it unfolds. It's difficult and it unfolds over time. It's a lifetime process. There's never a place where we say, I can tell you now, almost 80, I'm still working on my identity, because it keeps changing as my life keeps changing, right?
Yeah.
If we do our identity work and identify basically who we're attached to, who's important to us, who are we, who do we belong with, who are our peeps, then we can move into the next core issue. The next one is intimacy. And we can't have intimacy if we don't have an identity. That's the trick. Yeah. Because we have to know what we want, what we bring to the table, what we need, who we are, who are we offering to another human being. So it takes attachment skills and a full understanding of basically who we are, so that we can move into deep connections to other people. Because our basic human need is to belong, and we learn most of our lessons in life through those deep, intimate connections that we make. And ultimately, if we've done that work, we get into issues of control and mastery. And I've always said to Deborah, we got it wrong. It should never be mastery and control. It always should be loss of control and gain of mastery. So first, we have to be really clear what control is, what we've lost, what we have control of. And then we have to go through steps of mastery, which is really hard work. And it means we come up against old habitual behavior patterns that cause us to have to think about who we are in every step we make for a period of time. Part of mastery is having our story clear in our mind. So for a lot of our children, having a clear understanding of their story from conception to the present gives them an opportunity for mastery in their life, to feel like a whole, solid, strong, emotionally equipped adult. And for most of us as parents, it really is about saying, I'm not the only parent, but I am the parent, the parenting parent, the person who gave you the environment that you could pick and choose from. So I hope that helps. I hope that answers it. Long story short.
I don't know, that was fantastic. I know that it's hard to take a full thick book and try and summarize it
Right.
in such a small time, so I appreciate it. And from what I'm hearing too, and again, what I've learned with reading the book and taking the courses is really, as you mentioned, it's not a linear, it's not, okay, you did the one, check mark, never have to deal with that again, we can move on. It's ongoing. And I know even through my own experiences and seeing my children experience, sometimes, it's 2 steps forward, 5 steps back. So I appreciate that. How you said, first it was linear and now you've moved it to kind of like a circle because it just.
Yeah, you roll along. I always say, you roll along. But the issue for me is that if you do the big work of whatever it is that brought you into the constellation fold, if you will, if you do the big work and you gain some mastery, get some tools, right? That's what that mastery is. It's a tool bag. Then every time we have another loss, and it doesn't have to be just connected to our adoption experience. I mean, our kids, their best friends move away, they break up with a boyfriend. I mean, it's not always attached to adoption. But once we learn the skill, the mastery tools, then when we get back on that wheel with another loss, we're able to process it in a very different way, because now we know what comes next. Oh, I wonder what I feel responsible for. Oh, I wonder how I'm going to get to forgiveness. Oh, I better take some time off to grieve this because, I'm not dealing with it. Gee, I wonder how that affected my identity. So we have to be willing to kind of go through that wheel and roll along in life and recognize that we're going to hit boulders in the road that are going to slow us down. But once we have the tools, we know how to pick up and go again.
And I think as parents as well, once we are able to recognize what that might look like for our children, because I'm sure it's going to look different for everybody,
Yes.
we can support them in there to say, and I remember, sometimes it might seem like such a small incident, but I can see how it hits my kids at the core. So I'm able to help them with the tools, because a lot of times even ourselves, we don't always have the tools in the moment or have the ability to reflect back. So
Right.
I found that personally helpful.
Good.
Okay, I'm going to skip some questions because I think we kind of answered as we went. This is a general question for you. What advice would you give to adoptive kid and customary care families who are just beginning their adoption journey? So maybe families who are just waiting to be matched or waiting to be placed.
Recognize that we all have fantasies about what it's going to be like, and that part of the loss is that the child who joins our family is never the one we had in our brain. So, we have to be willing. Adoption's about adaptation. So we have to be willing to change, and adults should be the ones who do the changing. It shouldn't have to be the children. So we have to adapt to their needs, and that it is going to change how we function as individuals and in our marriage or partnership. It's going to change our relationship in the community. It's going to affect our identity, and not seeing that as losses, but seeing that as tremendous opportunities for growth and new people. And that this can be parenting is a very exciting and challenging journey, challenge, I was going to say. And if you add adoptive parenting on top of it, it's more so. And if you add parenting older children or a sibling set or children of a different race or culture than you, then it's even more challenging. And you have to have faith in yourself, and you have to be willing to let outsiders come in and support you. You have to be willing to use a support system. Your kids are going to need a support system. and you need a support system. And two things that I learned really early on: keep your sense of humor and don't take everything personally. Two real important pieces. And treasure, if you're in a partnership, treasure your partner, because long after your kids are gone, that's who you're left with. So if you don't take care of yourself and take care of your partner, you'll have nothing left for your children. So don't put yourself at the bottom, put yourself at the top.
That's very beautifully said. Thank you for that. You know, it was really interesting hearing you answer that in talking about the identity piece for us as parents, because, you know, I had my background is in social work, and I read all the books and I thought that I was ready and woo, I'm doing this. And then I came home and I didn't realize the impact that the switch of identity would have on me, because I wasn't Catherine, I was so-and-so's mom. And that was huge. And in the getting support, I mean, I had gone through enormous post-adoption depression and was so embarrassed because I thought I had to be okay because everyone was excited. And so, you know, I think if I knew the knowledge ahead of time, if I knew post-adoption depression existed, if I knew that I would struggle with it, I think my experience would have been different. So I think any awaiting parent or anyone who's just beginning their journey, please to Sharon, because it's truth, and it's okay to not be okay in the process and to need that help, because I was headstrong and I didn't think I needed help. And it wasn't until, you know, people pointed out to me that I realized, oh, wait a minute, I need to get support with this. So I appreciate you saying that.
And, you know, and one of my favorite books that came out a few years ago, and I can't think of the authors at the top of my brain, is called Post-Adoption Blues. And it really talks about the fact that you know, there's post-birth blues, but there's post-adoption blues, and it's a normal thing for people to have to address. And I don't know if you can look it up, Chantel, and put it up there with the authors, but I think it's really a good book to be you know, aware of. I know I can relate with you, Catherine, because I'd already been a social worker for many years. I was already a parent to a 6-year-old that I'd given birth to. I was happily married. I was a social worker working in adoptions, doing family assessments. And when we brought home our 2.5-year-old and 3.5-year-old sibling set, I failed at everything miserably. And I remember saying to my husband, maybe if we don't get through this, I'm going to have to give up my social work degree, and we're going to have to give up our firstborn child, because obviously we don't know what we're doing. And it was such an awakening. That's why I said forgiving yourself, being human, and not taking all the blame for everything becomes so important.
Absolutely. I know we were chatting earlier too about just like validating those experiences. And when we take courses and sitting around the table and seeing other families, you're like, oh, it's not just me. I get it. And you know, I had mentioned we share this article still, and I know it was published in the 80s, but still families are like, oh, here it is. Here's the language. So it's you know, it's timeless because it's the foundation of everything.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to read a review. We do our research here. So we pulled a review from your book, and we just had a question. So, you know, there were multiple reviews from professionals, you know, just indicating how important this book was in understanding their field. So this is one of the quotes that we pulled. This latest work will thoughtfully guide all readers touched by the adoption constellation. So birth parents, adoptive parents, and adoptees. Fresh insight, solid research, and 60 years of adoption work by the authors makes this a must-have in all of your libraries. My only regret is not having this research 20 years ago, as I helped pregnant women make the life-altering choices about parenting versus placing their children for adoption. We were just wondering, did you have the intent to eventually impact professionals as well? Because I feel like as the adoptive side, we feel the ripples of this, but now the ripples have been absolutely impacting professionals. So I'd love to hear kind of how how it developed into the professional side as well.
Well, when you bring forth a concept that's impacting the people that it's intended to, so in this instance, the constellation, it got very personal, obviously, for all of us. Then if the professional community doesn't take notice of that, then the treatment that they bring to folks when they're trying to work themselves through the core issues, particularly those who stay stuck for a really long time in grief, who are afraid to look at the losses, who, we live, and I know from lecturing in Canada over the years that you're in a similar place, and that is that, adoption is seen as a problem-solving event. So it's very hard for people to say, well, I don't know that it's always the best choice for kids, or I don't know that it isn't extremely difficult, or, what we know really is that the birth first parents never really heal from this. They carry this all their lives.
Yeah.
That, it's like a double train track is always the way I talk about it. And, you can be happy that you're adopted and you fit in your adoptive family and you love your adoptive family, and you can be angry and upset and in touch deeply by having been relinquished or taken away from your parents through the court system. So, these things don't live in isolation. If therapists, if the professionals, whether it's those who impact these decisions in the child welfare system or those who catch all of us, the therapists out there in the community, if we're not conscious of this, we are really missing the opportunity of normalizing and healing those experiences. And so I think that therapists, not all therapists, but I think many therapists have seen this as a way to work differently with folks who come to them who've been touched by any of these kinds of losses. And I do as much training of professionals as I do of, I still feel mostly connected to the constellation members because that's where I live my life as a parent, a grandparent, and a great-grandparent. But I think that it's very gratifying to see how many professionals have taken this seriously. And I still carry, and I don't know about Canada, but I still carry the sadness of two things. One, that there's a huge turnover in most agencies. So people barely learn what the issues are and then they move on to something else. And so since we know it takes a minimum of 5 years to actually get any kind of grasp as a professional about what these issues really mean to their clients, I find that sad. And I find that people will say, I don't see any of these issues. My kids are happy. My kids love being adopted, or I've never felt any of this. I've never felt any loss. And what troubles me, and I know I'm taking up a lot of time here, but what troubles me is that those of us who are constellation members and also therapists often haven't done our own work. So when we receive constellation members, if we haven't done our own work, just like if parents haven't done their own work, they can't help their children. If we haven't done our own work, we are not going to be in a position to really help our clients. And I run into far too many constellation members who are therapists who've not done their own work. And that makes me sad and frightened at the same time.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, and I think the sentiments are similar here in Canada as well. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, we're being mindful of the time, but we have more questions, so I'm going to do my best to ask them. You briefly mentioned about, if people, don't believe there are core issues. Can I ask, and this might be a very basic kind of question, do people experience always all 7 core issues, or could it be some or not the other? Like, I'm wondering your thoughts.
I think we can be stuck at one for a very long time, but they are intimately linked. One does lead to another. So if you're saying, well, I just felt grief, okay, or I've struggled with my identity, but the rest of this stuff I can't relate to, then always I go back to, well, something brought you there. And the something that I think we need to start with is what losses do you think you had that have impacted your identity? Or what losses do you feel? And they'll go to something pretty broad. Well, I didn't give birth to this child, let's say. Well, what does that mean? You know, what's attached to giving birth? And then you start to drill down to the announcing to your mate that you're pregnant and announcing to your family that you're pregnant and people getting excited and asking you what name. And then you go out in public and you're pregnant and people set aside for you, or please sit down, or are you feeling okay? So it's all those little details along the way that add up to the losses that can cause you to grieve. And so, yes, you can be stuck and focused on one, but they're each linked, and the healing comes from examining each of them. Because we get that question a lot, Catherine. It's a great question. And they are so intimately linked that just saying I only felt one of them makes no sense.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that clarification. And, you know, as you were talking, it kind of, you know, triggered this thought that, and something that we hear often in the adoption community is, you know, if a child was adopted at birth and they don't remember their adoption, then, you know, they're okay. And you know, I have a child who we adopted right from the get-go, and, you know, saying, oh, well, they're so well adjusted. And, you know, I think it's important to know that it also, from hearing you, it doesn't have to be these grand gestures of feelings. It can also be kind of subtleties as well. Do you think that's a fair statement to say?
I think there's subtleties. I think we as parents want there to be subtleties and not big things. I have to remind people, well, your child spent 9 months with another mother and maybe a father around and other voices. In that last trimester, they were fully sentient human beings. They heard voices. They knew the difference between day and night. They were bathed in chemicals that the birth mother may have been feeling that were released because of fear or joy or hunger or her addiction experiences or violence if she was in a violent relationship. They had an experience before they ever came to you. Now, they don't have the words for that, but those emotions are stored in their cells. I love Bessel van der Kolk's work on the body keeps the score. It's
yes.
all in there. We have a cellular memory. And there are worldwide, and I'm a part of one of those that gathers regularly, pre and perinatal psychologists and psychiatrists who meet regularly and talk about the early trauma of separation. I know Nancy Verrier's work in terms of the primal wound has been controversial for some and not for others, but there really is good information that says that children are aware when these major shifts occur. So it's, for me, an and also. It's not an either or. Right. It's either they did or they didn't. It's an and also. How many additional losses did they have? How many moves did they have? Did they go directly from this experience into your arms, Catherine? And so it was one move. Were you a sensitive parent who kind of adapted to the needs of this child and let this child adapt to you? Was it a sudden thing, or was there a transition between you and the family of origin? All of those things can affect how our children respond. And their temperament, their basic temperament. Some kids are just more curious. They feel more deeply. They're more sensitive on every level, and they're going to experience their adoption differently than children who are one day at a time kids. Some kids come into the world, well, that's how it is today. It's okay. So some of it's going to be temperament, and some of it's gender, because we have learned that females respond differently to that transition often than males do.
Wonderful, thank you. That wasn't on the list. I was just personally curious, so I appreciate that.
go for it.
I know it's something that comes up often, so I want to just throw that in there.
Sure.
So how are people, so we're all listening right now. We obviously have all fallen in love, well, first with you and the book and all the work that you're doing. How do people purchase the book, or how do people learn about what's coming up next? I know you mentioned a workbook as well. So is there a best way for people to learn about, what's coming up and what's next and how to actually purchase the book?
Well, do you use Amazon up there?
You do?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. The easiest way to purchase the book is just through Amazon.
Okay.
It'll come to you pretty quickly. And the first half of the book is all the core issues, updated research, tools, etc. Second half of the book is people who are members of the constellation, who look at the core issues through the framework of their experience. So some it's a look at the Latino community, the Black community, the internationally built family, the step parent community, the third party reproduction community. So it gives you some really clear perspectives. And that's through Amazon. I have a site. It's www.sharonroszia.com. And you can certainly check there, because we do update what's going on that site. And people, especially both Chantel and you, Catherine, if questions come up, if people need to reach me, feel free always to email me. If I'm busy training, I won't get back right away, but I won't ignore you. I'm a pretty good communicator. And if people have a need to connect with me directly, they can do that through Sharon at sharonroszia.com. And I'll get back to you as soon as I can.
Wonderful. That's dangerous.
I know.
People.
I have done this for years and years and years at big conferences and so on. And you know what? People only take advantage if it's really something that's important to them, and I honor that. I've never had anybody inappropriately take up my time. So I'm fine with that. I do tell people if it's just a quick answer or whatever, I'm thrilled. If you need an hour or two of my time, I'm probably going to charge you. But I'm reasonable and I work on a sliding scale, and I'm all in for people. So just let everybody know that.
Thank you so much. And just very quickly, are there any other plans? So I know you do a lot of talks and workshops. So is all of the information about all the amazing things that you do, all that can be found on your website?
Oh, the answer to that question is no. I have to be I'm not traveling anymore. I'm disabled. So I do everything online.
Okay.
But most things that I do are private to the organization that I do it for.
Okay.
So it's not like I can open it up. I'm doing 2 days of ACT training, but I can't have anybody do that. I've done Israel, I've done Australia, I've done New Zealand. I've been pretty busy online, but most of them are not saying,
come out to everybody. Right.
Yeah. I am doing a full day of training for the state of Georgia, April 24th, if there's any clinicians online watching. It's the Georgia Society for Clinical Social Workers, and it is for CEUs, and I think they're charging $60.
Oh, wow.
And I'm going to be doing a deep dive into the core issues. So that's one thing that they could look for. The Jewish Family Service in Chicago, May 25th, I'm doing a presentation. They're very aware that their community in Chicago the kids have been deeply traumatized by so much else that's been going on. All their early trauma has been re-triggered. They asked me to come in and do some work around that. And that's open to the public. So what I'll do, because you're raising an important question, is I will make sure that what is open to other people gets put on my website, so that people could know that they can pop in. Okay, I will take care of that.
I'm sorry for causing more work in your semi-retirement. I didn't mean to ask more.
Well, grab me while you can, guys, because next year I'm retired.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your candid answers and just being so open. This is such an important thing that I know this is going to have a huge impact on so many. And it was just an honor for me to actually speak with you as well, because your work has had a big impact on my family. So I appreciate you.
Thank you. I appreciate you and all of you that are listening. I truly do. And thank you for the honor. It always does feel like an honor. So thank you very, very much for reaching out.
Well, thank you, Sharon. The honor is definitely all ours. For those that are looking for those links, they're all in the chat. So just scroll through. You can find links to the book. Sharon mentioned her book and her website if you want to learn more or to order a book for yourself. We wish you a wonderful week and a weekend. We'll be back on Tuesday with Andrea Warnick, registered psychotherapist, and we're talking about supporting our kids who are experiencing grief and loss. So stay tuned and we'll be well, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you so much.
Okay.